Blue lights flashed in Colin Dixon's rearview mirror as he drove home from a late shift at the Securitas cash depot. He pulled over, heart steady, training in mind. If ever stopped by the police, he was to show his work ID and insist on following them to the station, never get in their car. But tonight, something was off. The voices were strange, the glances too long, and his alarm broken at home. So when the men in uniform told him to step inside their car, he obeyed. They weren't real officers. They were criminals, ex-fighters, and career hustlers. They could have let him go, vanished into the night. But this was 8 months in the making. Burner phones, prosthetic masks, and an inside man. And Colin was just the first move. Their next stop would be his wife and son. It was the beginning of the largest cash robbery in British history. Lee Lightning Murray, 27, was a South London cage fighter with a rising MMA career. Signed with UFC, 8 wins, 2 losses, the world ahead of him. But life changed one night in Mayfair. Outside a club, a fight broke out. Lee jumped to help a friend. A blade flashed. He was stabbed again and again. Head, chest, heart. Doctors fought for 7 hours to save him. His lung collapsed, his artery torn. He was revived 4 times and somehow survived. 10 days later, he left the hospital. A month later, he was back in the gym. But his body wasn't the same, and no doctor would clear him to fight again. A criminal record blocked him from a US visa. His career was over before it began. He was broke and angry. But Lee had a backup plan, one whispered months before by 2 acquaintances, Leah Rushia and Jetmir BP Papa. They discovered an unmarked warehouse in Tonbridge, a quiet town south of London. Inside, they said, was up to £200 million in cash. A hidden depot, one of the UK's main money hubs. They had scouted it once, but a police officer scared them off. Now Lee wanted in. The place was a fortress, with steel fences, cameras, and guards. To hit it, they'd need vehicles, weapons, and a crew. Rushia and Jetmir worked for a used car dealer, 48-year-old Stuart Royal, a man deep in debt and desperate. He secured access to a friend's farm, without the owner's knowledge, as a key hideout. He brought in his friend, Sean Lupton, a builder and boxing coach who loved watching Ocean's 11 and dreamed of pulling one off. Lee added his own friends, Roger Coots, who had a storage container, and Paul Allen, his loyal sidekick. Paul often ran with a man named Kane Patterson, an ex-suspect in a murder case. Now they had muscle, transport, and a base. They still needed eyes inside. Jetmir turned to an Albanian friend, Emir Hysanaj. Emir signed with the temp agency that supplied Securitas staff and kept transferring jobs until he landed inside the depot. Slowly, he mapped the building, doors, codes, camera angles, and who had access to what. Paul and Kane bought tiny cameras for him to wear, letting the crew watch the layout in detail. The plan was a tiger kidnapping, a crime where offenders abduct a key employee's family to force them to cooperate. In this case, Colin Dixon, the depot manager, was the target. They'd kidnap his wife and child to make sure he opened the vault. For disguises, Lee went to a salon owner, Michael Demetrio, whose trainee, Michelle Hogg, had studied theatrical prosthetics. Lee told them he was creating a cage-fighting video game called Hitman. They made silicone masks, not knowing they were helping stage a real crime. By February 2006, the pieces were in place. The vehicles were ready, masks built, weapons stashed at the farm. They knew Colin's every move. All that was left was to strike. On February 21st, Colin left work at 5:30 p.m. His alarm was still broken. At 6:20, blue lights flashed behind him. 2 officers stepped out of an unmarked car and told him he'd been speeding. He didn't follow protocol. He climbed into their car. Within minutes, his wrists were cuffed too tightly, and the road veered away from town. 40 minutes later, he was dragged from the car and shoved into a van. At home, his wife Lynn was worried. It wasn't like he was late. Then came a knock. Police, they said. Colin had been in an accident and was in the hospital. They offered to drive her there, urging her to bring her son. She hesitated. Their uniforms didn't look right, and the car was unmarked. When she asked to see ID, they grabbed her and her son, forcing them into the car. At the farm, Colin was pressed for every detail about the depot. He refused to talk until he saw his family. When they showed him Lynn and his son, terrified but alive, he gave up everything: codes, schedules, and where the money was kept. The men removed their prosthetics and prepared for work. Kane stayed in uniform. He'd play the part of the officer. At 1:21 a.m. on February 22nd, the convoy reached the depot. Kane drove, Colin hidden in the trunk. 100 yards from the gate, Kane got out and put Colin behind the wheel. The guard inside recognized Colin and saw a policeman beside him. He buzzed them in. That guard, a last-minute substitute, had no idea he'd just opened the door to the biggest robbery in British history. Inside, the robbers struck fast. 4 men, Lee, Paul, Leah, and Roger, entered with guns and masks. They zip-tied employees and forced Colin to open doors. In the van, Lynn and her son huddled under blankets. The vault door swung open. 200 million pounds sat in wire cages. But there was one problem. Each cage weighed a quarter ton, and none of them could drive the forklift. They untied the only trained operator, Tony Mason. Tony pretended to fail, crashing into walls to stall them. Frustrated, the gang began hauling cash by hand. Eventually, Tony gave in and started moving cages, but chose the low-value ones to minimize the loss. For over an hour, the crew loaded cage after cage. They took 17 in total, 53 million pounds. They locked the hostages inside the empty cages, leaving Colin for last. The fear was real. Would they kill everyone now that they had the money? They didn't. They vanished into the night, millionaires in minutes. Inside, one worker, Mel, had a key in her pocket. Her hands were tied, but Lynn's young son squeezed through a cage gap, grabbed the key, and freed everyone. At 3 a.m., they triggered the alarm. The nightmare was over for them, but for the robbers, it had just begun. At the farm, the gang burned evidence, phones, clothes, and even Lynn's purse. They stashed cash in barns and garages, each taking tens of thousands. But 50 million pounds is hard to hide by sunrise, the story broke. 53 million missing. It was chaos, the biggest cash heist in British history. The first break came fast. A van was found abandoned near a pub. Inside, Colin's son's footprint, a glove, and a receipt linking it to Stuart Royal. Police then got a tip about the hair-hectic salon officers raided Michael and Michelle. She panicked, dumping silicone scraps into the trash. They arrived before the garbage truck and pulled the evidence. Michelle was arrested. Next came a shocking find. Police stopped Olympian Chris Bowles. In his van, guns, vests, and 1.3 million pounds. He said the bags belonged to Leah and Jetmir. He walked free, but now the police had names raids followed. Homes were torn apart. Inside, they found boiler suits, tape, and ammunition. Soon after, Stuart was caught driving a blue BMW after a chase. The net was closing. Lee and Paul fled to France, then Morocco, slipping across borders while others were arrested. Jetmir and Leia made a worse choice. They checked into a cheap hotel near London and were ambushed days later. Another lead took police to a storage unit owned by Roger. Inside, 10 million pounds in stacked cash. Roger was arrested at Heathrow after a ski trip. The inside man, Emir, stayed calm at first. He denied everything, but phone records showed 70 calls between him and Jetmir. Bank deposits worth 30,000 pounds. Surveillance of him filming inside the depot. When asked for the clothes he wore that day, he claimed he'd recycled them. He only wore new clothes. The police didn't buy it. He was charged with conspiracy to rob. Meanwhile, in Morocco, Lee and Paul were living like kings. Lee bought a mansion, a Ferrari, and partied nightly, throwing money around like confetti. But they were under surveillance. On June 25, 2006, Moroccan police surrounded them. Lee tried to run but was tackled to the ground. Paul was caught outside a Starbucks. Inside their villa, guns, cocaine, and piles of cash. Morocco refused to extradite Lee. He was a citizen through his father. He was jailed locally for drugs, guns, and assaulting police. Paul, a British citizen, was sent back and eventually sentenced to 18 years. In the UK, Stuart, Leah, Jetmir, Roger, and Amir faced trial. Security was extreme. Armored vans, snipers, sealed juries. Colin testified from a safe house. All 5 were found guilty. 4 were given life with a minimum of 15 years. Amir received 20. Lee's Moroccan case dragged on for years. In 2010, he was finally convicted for masterminding the heist. He is 25. He's still behind bars today, due for release in 2035. 32 million pounds remains missing. Some say it's buried, others laundered or hidden overseas. Colin and his family fled the UK, starting a new life in Australia under protection. Even the robbers weren't safe. In 2019, Paul Allen was shot 6 times at home, left paralyzed. The motive remains unknown. 53 million pounds vanished in one night. Britain barely avoided economic collapse. A cage fighter became a legend. A manager lost his country. And a child who crawled through metal bars to free his mother became the quiet hero of the biggest cash robbery in British history.